Я не твій брат, ти не сестра моя, ніколи не розказуй мені, і в чому є вина на нашій землі. Люди, як кораблі, кожен пливе, поки вланеться, і поки глибока вода, глибока і темна до самого дна, до самого дна. На глибині зустрічаються світ, так ніби морі місця нема, і труться потами, аж тоне земля, від зависті, від ласті зла, хтось не доплив, бо йому помогли, набрати повні трумі води, постати героями твої вини, дуже хотіли вони.
A story is true, a story is untrue. A story is a work of transformative fiction. As time extends, it matters less and less. Hello, I'm Kendra Spring Classic, and welcome back to Reading Between the Lines, a podcast by fandom nerds for fandom nerds. This podcast is all about fan fiction, the much-maligned art form that, nevertheless, brings many people cathartic levels of joy, not just in the reading of it, but in the creation of it as well. If this is your first time listening, welcome. We're so glad to have you. But be sure to go back and listen to our previous episodes. These are evergreen stories, which can be revisited again and again. You're certain to discover something new each time. I know I have. In last month's episode, I featured an introspective fic giving us a glimpse of Eleanor Guthrie's deeper motivations, written by Mary, aka Witch Queen. And we spoke at length about everything from our own childhood trauma to Eleanor's final moments. We're keeping with that introspective vibe as we're shifting focus yet again to dive deep down into Flint's tortured and lonely psyche with There Most Certainly Lies a Dark Moment Between Here and There by Leckie, aka Short John Silver, who I'll be chatting with after the story. This short 15-minute story is a rapid descent into the belly of the beast. As we cut to the heart of Flint, we expect to find nothing but violence and rage at the very core, but instead, we find a profound love combined with a deep and unshakable fear. This is the complex beauty of Flint, the beating heart of this story. Join me as we illuminate the dark and find freedom. There Most Certainly Lies a Dark Moment Between Here and There by Ghost of Anne Bonny and Short John Silver. Summary. Translation of my first work in this fandom. Flint has a think during his stay in the Nassau Fort, a cross between Season 4, Episode 5, a famous song by Scriabin, and Taras Shevchenko's poem, Tu me moyi, with a dash of Adam Mickiewicz, and his poem, Nie Pavnochich. Notes. First ever fic in the Black Sails fandom. Many thanks to my friend Deck for helping me figure out what book it was that Flint had in the fort, Zoe for the old maps of New Providence Island, and Ghost of Anne Bonny for beta reading and helping me translate. This would have been impossible without you. Inspired by my own insomnia and all the light and darkness themes that are so prominent in the show. most certainly lies a dark moment between here and there. Flint couldn't sleep. It wasn't that he was completely unable to close his eyes until the morning, but the meager few hours he would manage to steal from the endless darkness in order to feel peace, at least for a brief moment, those could hardly be called sleep. The nightmares with Miranda's apparition haven't visited him since that night at the Maroon Camp, when he offered their queen a deal and declared war on the English. No, it wasn't the ghosts and visions perturbing his mind, hardly unperturbed as it is. Thoughts consumed him under the cover of the night, rolled over him like dark waters, waves dragging a ship whose hull was staved by cannon fire to the bottom of the sea. His mind never quieted, like a swarm of insects, buzzed like bees whose hive was stirred up by a bear. And among that thrum, he could make out the descant of one song that wouldn't cease. He might still be alive. The book that Flint's hand was still holding by inertia, force of habit, though there was no use from it in the dark. The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, a gift from Miranda, was the only reminder of him still to be found in the fort's cell. Despite the fact that its only resemblance of the Marcus Aurelius volume, so dear to his heart, was limited to the cover's color. Nobody knew what had happened to Meditations, whether it was lost during the battle in Nassau Harbor, where the governor's obstruction led them into a trap that nearly cost the crew their ship and nearly cost him silver. Ever since that moment, and until the day he climbed up that hill and slit the redcoat's throat to find Silver alive and well, Flint's world was a valley flooded by mist, white and opaque like milk. Between their losses, Billy's betrayal, the conflict at the plantation where Bones pointed guns at him, Maudie, their men, Flint barely was aware of himself, never mind his possessions. Maybe Charles was right after all. Being so skeptical and dismissive of attachment to things, physical, material things, fragile and impermanent. Something he was told once by the late Mr. Scott, truly a king behind both thrones, though Flint at the time had no idea just how apt that characterization was. Scott spoke of transience, change, flow of time, of impermanence being the only permanent thing on this earth. Perhaps he was right, too. At that moment, it seemed that the flow of time had taken everything from him. And would there be any point in continuing this account? Maudie probably wouldn't even remotely ask herself that question at this stage. Nothing is more important to her than her cause, the holy duty before her people to settle the account with the past and to give them a future. But Flint, if he were to be completely honest with himself, needed the fight to be personal at the core, for him to be passionate about it. Just like eons ago, as he stood up from his seat in the Hamilton estate and told Alfred to leave his own house, once it became personal. He was willing to lay it all on the altar of Thomas's dream, for it had become close and dear to his heart by then. But now, after a long 10 years, the last of which was filled with doubts and contemplations, whether it was worth it to keep down this path at all. Had he not betrayed yet again that which the three of them with Miranda, had started once? After all this time, he was at some point certain that he couldn't keep walking. The path before him seemed errant and dark, and the lantern that glimmered at the end of it, acting as a soul-guiding light, had been doused altogether. If it weren't for one short speech from Silver one dark night at the camp, who knows, maybe he'd never have seen that light flicker again. Quite odd, Flint concedes, that this yesterday's stranger, no one from nowhere, belonging to nothing, of whose past only snippets were known, crumbs that he was willing to scatter to whomever dared ask, since when has he taken that place? Could one even compare? The book slips out of Flint's hand, and quietly, though the sound reverberated so distinctly in the dark and silent cell, clatters onto the floor. He'd forgotten he was even holding it. The noise jolted him out of the daymare mist. But this time, it was no daymare, no delirium. He really catches himself on a thought that losing Silver, albeit for a short while, impacted him to a comparable degree, akin to— No, this is utterly ridiculous. Flint's fingertips rub at his brow. He picks up the volume from the cold stone floor. No, this must be insomnia playing tricks on his mind. But the joy of that instant, when, in the midst of their strategic meetings, he learned that John was alive, and surely hunted, with the governor's vassal putting a bounty on his head. How about that? The joy and hope he felt then could be put in the same category as the anticipation of his reunion with Thomas, returning to London after 3 months apart, which felt twice as long. "John," he spoke to the empty room. Sounds a bit unnatural. Odd. Rolls off the tongue strangely. Flint never called him that. Not in front of the men, nor when they were alone. Only in his thoughts. And only later, just after— Although what was so odd about it? He called his quartermaster Gates Hal only once in the recent few years. Just soon before killing him. No, this comparison was even worse. Anywhere he looked in Flint's past, there was always a void. A dark abyss left behind by those dear to him. Thomas, Miranda, Gates. And not just for one of them. The latter that was indeed on his consciousness. But for all of their deaths he had blamed himself to a degree. Maybe that's why Silver's words that night, before the battle, had stung so much. And the events several days ago, in the obstructed harbor, only added poisonous roots to the pot in which the potion of his guilt boiled and stirred. The understanding that he'd never be able to keep those he loves away from harm, and it'd have been better if they never became— What? What were they? Captain and quartermaster? Friends? Partners in crime? Future foes? One of which would inevitably have to give way to the other one day and walk off into the shadows. He remembered how that very night on Maroon Island, Silver compared himself to the line of Flint's partners, insinuating himself as successor. Partners. No, that sounds too loud, too pompous. But since then, their bond couldn't be described as purely friendship, let alone merely a working relationship. But the right word refused to come. And once again he catches himself on a thought and a choice of word. Those he loves. Is that so? Was that the reason why he had nearly plunged himself into the water, leaving behind his men, and only the realization that there wasn't a way to explain it to them if he'd left them to continue the fight without him for one man? Only that reminder had stopped him then. Once, during one of their training sessions, Silver had asked him, "Could that which you know of me, what I'm able to show you, be enough?" What he really was asking was, would I be enough? And Flint didn't know what to answer then. But now, after the past week's events, after the harbor, after Underhill, doubt gnawed at him even more fervently. He couldn't abandon his men, abandon Maudie and their cause. After what he'd seen on her island, after meeting her people, it was as if his eyes were opened anew, reorienting to the new light. In offering the Queen that deal, he was first and foremost thinking about the beneficial outcome for both parties, or at least aimed at convincing them to see allies in his men and himself. But even during his speech, sitting across from Maudie and her mother, he was alight with the desire to deal such a devastating blow to the Empire that the whole world would see what it is their joined resistance was capable of achieving. Flint could imagine that this goal took precedent for Maudie. It wasn't a choice or option. The goal to fight for their freedom, when at least this small plot of land, for all of them, but first of all for her people, because their freedom was ripped away from them with roots, and in a most painful, cruel way, to show the empires that they aren't here to stay. Their time will come. Their existence is not inevitable, and there'd be a time after them. He could entrust that to her, even if he could no longer keep fighting himself. The cause was in good hands with her. John was in good hands. Well, there it is again. The name he never called Silver out loud, and maybe never will. Was that even his real name at all? Flint's mind returns again and again, like tidal waves to the shore, to their sparring on the cliff and their conversation. Who were you? I don't know who you truly are. The difference between you know of me all there is to be known and all I can bear, cope with being known. Something bothered him about that phrasing, as if Silver himself was unable to reach those memories, like they were hidden in the same kind of chest as the one he had buried on the island that night, when he had shown all of his own past's treasure to Silver. But the key from John's cache was as if thrown overboard. And who had it? Probably just Neptune, as Jack would have said. Maybe it was that he hadn't lied then, saying that he had no story to tell, because he himself was unable to read that story. Maybe Neptune alone knew it after all. Flint picks up the red, almost black in this silent dark, volume, and places it beside him on the bed. Eleanor had been kind to him and provided a bed, a luxury many other prisoners in that fort surely could only dream of. But what use was it to him when the swarm of bees in his head wouldn't quiet its buzzing, and when the silence and dark around him provided nothing that could drown it out? With Thomas, it had been all simple and definite. They met through work circumstances, became friends, then eventually lovers. James had been sparked alight with his ideas, and couldn't have imagined a scenario in which he'd leave their account for anything, or anyone else, and could no longer imagine himself without him. When he found out where his beloved was taken, when he stood in the Admiral's office, when he had to pack up and sail a world away, he barely was aware of himself anymore. His world was shrouded in darkness, thick and opaque, akin to the depths of the ocean, where black waters hide monstrous creatures from old sailors' tales. But there had been one beacon of light that always glimmered at the end of that dark, winding path into the unknown, an understanding in whose name he'd be doing all that he would do in the next decade. What if Silver's guess was right? What if, having sent someone out to investigate, they do find out that Thomas is truly there, alive but imprisoned? What if he goes there himself to free him, meet his beacon of light, and upon meeting him, would that mark the end of his path? Or just the same as in that harbor battle, something would still drag him back into the thick of the fight, the cause of freeing everyone from under the yoke, because now it seems that he can no longer imagine himself without this. What would their reunion mean if they knew that, in the grand scheme of things, they weren't free, and neither was everyone else? Would Thomas accept him like this, as what he'd become, covered in the blood of many more than he could keep count? Would he recognize him now? Still dedicated to the ordeal fully, but for different reasons now. Would he still love him? But all of this was merely guesswork and hypotheticals about a tomorrow that could bring any number of things. Tomorrow, well, already today, since it was long past midnight. But something was telling Flint that day would bring a lot of loss, a lot of grief. They had a mountain to scale on this path, and it would be a challenge. But maybe, beyond that mountain, new horizons would open. Flint leaves all hope of falling asleep before dawn, and soon enough, on the dark horizons of New Providence Island, where the starless sky bled into the obscure depths of the sea, where on the ancient maps in the corners there lurked dragons, a beam of sunlight would rise. Today I have the unique pleasure to sit down with Leckie, a.k.a. Short John Silver. Leckie is a Ukrainian who has escaped his hometown of Odessa, now the focus of Russian attacks, and is currently living in London. I've been a fan of his Black Sails analysis on Twitter since I first joined the fandom a few years ago, and my admiration for his enormous brain has grown exponentially. We've got a lot to dissect today, so let's dive right in. Well, welcome, Leckie. It's so fabulous to have you on the podcast. I'm so glad that you could join us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really glad that I got to be on here. It's such an honor to have my fic be presented on the podcast. I never thought it would happen, but here we are.
It's fantastic. It's really nice leading into this type of fic from our previous episode, which was an introspective fic featuring Eleanor. And so transitioning into kind of the parallel that is set up as Flint, there really is a mirror in those two characters, and seeing both of these stories from their different perspectives. It's a very interesting kind of back-to-back way to feature these stories. So when did you first discover Black Sails?
I think it was 2021. It might have been 20. No, I think it was 21. It was just, the pandemic. Everybody was sitting at home, and I was looking for something new. And as a kid, I had read Treasure Island, and I was like about 11 maybe, and I didn't really have too much of a recollection, but I had some. I know who Long John Silver was, and I have heard the name Flint. What's funny is we have snack brands like those, croutons, the beer snack called Flint, and so that name was on my mind a lot. I have posted memes like, eating him, but yes, and so I saw this series promoted somewhere. I don't even remember where. And it was like in the description that it is a prequel to Treasure Island. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. So I clicked on it and I decided to check out. So from the first episode, as we're introduced to all these guys, so that's John Silver. So this is his origin story. Look at him, this rascal of a man. And so that's how they are imagining Flint. This is what they think he used to be like, because we never get to see him in the book, right? It's just like echoes of him. It's just his ghost haunting the Skeleton Island. Mm-hmm. It's just the voice that they can hear still in the woods. But we actually get to see him and his origin story as well, which is like, it's fabulous that they decided to just go and do this.
I think so many people discovered Black Sails during the pandemic. I mean, forced to hunt through and find any form of entertainment that was out there as shows were, ceasing production and things like that. So a lot of the pre-existing stuff was starting to, really resurface. And I think Black Sails benefited a lot from people going back and saying, hey, what haven't I seen? So right. What really resonated with you with Black Sails?
I mean, when I was first watching, it was prior to everything, to the war, and I had one thing appeal to me, and now it's another thing. But back then, it was definitely this, uncompromising queer wrath and the strive for liberation and for living the way that you are and not making any compromises with establishment, with society, civilization, and not letting people rewrite your story. But also, now at this point, I'm looking back and I realize just like how much more it resonates on a different level now, because we are faced with a force such as Flint describes it right in the first episode, that it doesn't see us as adversaries, it doesn't see us as criminals, it sees us as monsters, and it means to eradicate us. And I am really feeling this right now. I think he was right, and this is what empires do. And now, as we stand, in such a time resisting an empire, I can really, really feel it. I think on one hand, I want to tell people to watch this, tell my fellow Ukrainians to watch this, because it will be cathartic in a lot of ways. But also, I understand that it might hit a bit too close to home to some of them right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally see how that can be so strong in its parallel, and especially with the idea of stories and who is controlling the narrative. Because now,
absolutely.
Yeah, the way this is being framed and all of the rhetoric that it's going back and forth, it is so much. We're starting to see these people like Elon Musk has done so much damage.
I was strangling him with my bare hands.
Distorted the narrative so much.
I mean it.
And it really is like we're talking about, the monsters in the stories they tell their children. And that is really what they're doing.
I mean, when the dam was blown up, I kept hearing on the radio, on the BBC, I kept hearing like, oh, who did it? Are we wondering who did it? There's like different options and versions about this. One side is blaming the other, and the other side is like, no, it's unequivocal who did it, actually. And, this is not new, because they have been distorting and twisting the story about everyone that they've colonized for all of this time, for all of these centuries. Every single people, every single culture, that's been colonized by them, they have made up stereotypes, they have made up, demonized versions, they have made up all these notions that, oh, your culture doesn't really exist, it's not real, it's not a separate culture, you don't even have your own language, and try to destroy any trace. Like, this is what they're doing right now with the destruction of cultural, historical buildings and sites. It's like, yeah, they're trying to erase it in real time and rewrite it. And that is what really, really enrages me. As Miranda says, I am enraged. So yeah. I am as well.
Yeah. It's really eye-opening to see all of this shakedown on Twitter in terms of how the US's support of the war is splitting down party lines. And it's crazy. It's almost like, they see anyone who is supporting Ukraine, who has a Ukrainian flag in their bio, and automatically it's like, oh, well, I'm going to discount you because
it's the new pronouns in bio.
It really is.
Hello.
It really is.
Both Ukrainian and have pronouns.
It's astonishing to me how quickly people's minds can be swayed toward Russia in terms of everything we know about the entire history of not just the country, but, the current government. Like, it's just mind-boggling. I don't understand.
I have people who are my relatives who live in the occupied Crimea, and some of them have been actually, influenced by the propaganda, because on the internet, they have the firewalling, and on the TV, they get the propaganda instead of news, and they have started to internalize these messages already. And I think I have lost contact with some of them. I don't even talk to them anymore because I just don't know how to talk to them anymore. I don't know how to prove to them that this is not us bombing ourselves as they might so believe, that this is not all fake, that this is really happening, and it is happening. All of these missiles, all these ships, they're starting from Crimea, they're starting from there and heading our way.
It's
a tough one. And many, many people have these stories, or have, friends who have gotten under the propaganda, even, living in Donbass and living in other occupied territories, or straight up people who have relatives in Russia who have that because that's their only environment, and they have completely lost that relative because it's not, they cannot continue being in contact.
Man. Going back into thinking about Black Sails and in fandom interaction, have you been deeply entrenched in fandoms before, or is this the first one
No,
that
I
has
don't think
really
so.
kind of sucked you in?
This is definitely my first big sort of very involved fandom. I didn't really used to do this. I would just read something, play something, watch something, and then like maybe go on Tumblr for GIFs, and to read people's takes on it if it was something that really, got through to me in that way and shook me and I needed to see some meta, but I would like go and just read and be an observer. For some reason, specifically for Black Sails, I decided to go and find other people on Twitter and just talk to them back and forth. And it was interesting because at the same time, a lot of people were also starting to watch it, or they have recently finished it. And there was such a lively fandom at the time that I really just sort of dove right in. And it was there. It was happening. People were talking to each other. People were creating their theories, sharing their thoughts and opinions, their metas. Yeah, and I got so many mutuals out of this. I got some really close friends out of this. And I'm just so extremely grateful for this one pirate show that brought so many people together. Some of them, moved on already to other. Some of us have, changed our hyperfixations, but it's like, the friendships do last. And I love that. I love that it was specifically this thing that brought us together.
Yeah. And I think you and I probably got into the fandom around the same time. Cause I do remember when I first got into it and when I was finishing it, I think is when I finally went onto Twitter. Cause I try very hard not to spoil myself. I don't I like it because when the creators sit down to storyboard and to develop the show, there's a very specific way they want to tell the story. They want you to find things out in a specific way. That Flint and Thomas reveal happens at a very specific point in the story because they don't want you to go in feeling any kind of sympathy for Flint. They really do not.
Oh, I didn't know what to make of him.
Yeah. They want you to hate him because first they have to put you in this perspective where all of a sudden you're like, oh God, I've been judging him the way everyone else is. And you immediately feel that and you recoil. So
there's him as a monster because, yeah.
Exactly. So you have to swallow their narrative first, and then you are allowed to understand the full breadth of the story. And so with really great storytelling, that if you allow the writers to lead you into a dark room and guide you along the way, I think that is the best way to encounter any kind of media. And so that's why I really, really avoided any kind of Twitter interaction until I was finished. And I was worried coming out of this, like nobody's going to talk to you about this. It's been off the air for years. And to find such a lively discussion on Twitter at the moment, I was like, okay. And
I was pleasantly surprised. They're so very passionate still about it and so still ongoing. There was the quote bot of the script, and every time the bot was giving like some famous line, the famous monologues, everybody was just going crazy. I loved it so much.
And I think you were one of the earliest people that I interacted with on Twitter. And I gravitate towards a certain type of Twitter poster people who will connect on an intellectual or a literary kind of a literary approach to talking about a piece of media, because that's the way I watch things as well. This was also one of my first fan bases. I was connected with Outlander first, doing editing and fully entrenched in that fandom, but it never at any point had its hooks in me like Black Sails did.
Definitely.
it was something that I was involved in intellectually and theoretically, but like the story was not something that just overwhelmed my heart. And Black Sails really, really did that.
I think it's going to have its grips in me for long years to come. I might, go on to other things. I might develop new hyperfixations, discover new things that I'm like super passionate about. But I think this is the one I'm going to keep going back to. Because, whenever I'm loving this new revival that's happening right now. And the fact that there's going to be like a rewatch and we will all just be experiencing it all over again. Every time somebody posts something or something Black Sails related happen, or like Luke Arnold and the signed, one of my mutuals brought to him the Meditations book.
Yes. A day, a month, a year.
He just did that. For real. For a month, for a year, a month. Oh my God. I was so normal and staying about it.
Oh yeah. That was a day on Twitter when everybody lost their minds.
Right. I love how everybody just like flocked to it immediately. Everyone who was there before, like we just woke up and ran right back to it.
That was fantastic. So looking at your works on AO3, it looks like this is your first foray into fanfic writing. Is that true?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I literally never wrote a fanfiction before. I have done like little comics maybe that might have been, like doujinshi, that type of thing, which isn't published. It's very much like I hit a wall, writer's block, never really finished it. But I've never written a fan fiction. I didn't think I would. I really didn't think I would do this because I don't know. I wasn't thinking that this is my type of field because again, I'm not good with like constructing a story out of the scenes that follow each other. Like, there's a fabula, there is a plot. But this is interesting because this is, introspection. And that's really what I can do is that I can get into a character's mind, especially if it's a character so well written and introspected in the show that we know the insides of his head. And it was really like a field day, it's a lot to work with there.
Yeah, psychologically, there's so much at work. Absolutely so much to examine and just an endless amount of divergent ideas that can come from just his character. But you can say that pretty much across the board with the characters in Black Sails.
Yes, they all are so multi-layered, so multifaceted. There's so much to them that you can just go on and on and on and on talking about them. I recently have seen someone, was it a meta about Max? And I would also, I would talk about her on a different day, like for a long time. I wanted to write something with Max at the focus, actually, but it only is just an idea for now.
So what was it about Black Sails in particular that kind of coaxed you into writing fan fiction?
Yeah, this is a hard one to answer because I don't know. I suppose because it gripped me that much and I was still very much in that headspace and I kept like thinking about these characters, thinking about these dynamics day in and day out, that I just sort of, sometimes you just can't hold it inside you. You just have to pour it out. And I was doing metas, I was writing like these long threads on Twitter, like the one about Apocalypse Now references in the whole Charles Vane arc. And I participated in the zine, Freedom in the Dark. I wrote meta, which, I am more of a nonfiction essay type. But here, I think it's kind of a middle ground between a fiction and nonfiction in a way that it's kind of like, it is essay-ish, but it's still, within the canon verse, the universe of the show, and it's from the character's perspective. I might write something like this with introspection to Silver, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah. Silver is a very interesting one to explore because so much of him is a blank slate.
Right? I think, he's done that way on purpose. Like he says, I don't have a past. I don't have anything to cling to that defines me. And that is because when he enters the show, that's when the story starts. But when he steps onto the walrus, through him, we experience everything, like through his eyes, he is the blank slate for the audience, basically.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. He is the audience surrogate. And what's interesting is that an audience surrogate can so very easily blend into the background and be really the least interesting character in a story, but he transcends that so much while still maintaining that ambiguity. It's an amazing feat of writing and acting. It's just remarkable. Silver is an incredible character.
Definitely a lot of it too is Luke Arnold and how he played it, especially in the latter seasons.
Oh gosh, yeah.
It's just the power of that delivery. Yeah, they got the best cast. And I love how the cast is also completely obsessed with the show. To this day, they're like, this is their favorite thing they've ever done.
Yeah. And yeah, I recall Luke Arnold saying in an interview, because someone asked him, did you know when you were doing it, how good this was going to be? Did you have any idea? And he's like, oh yeah, we knew. We all knew, like, this was something special. And just the interplay with Luke Arnold and Toby Stephens, by the end of the run of the show, they were so in tune, like so many of their scenes, it's just little ticks of the eye. And you have there's an entire dialogue that happens in their eyes, and it is nothing more needed.
Amazing to the characters who have achieved that level of unity with their weird mind melding, their merging of souls.
Just incredible. Like, it is for someone who, because you can examine the show from someone who approaches it as a writer, and it is just astonishing. It's the most beautiful writing that I have seen in a television show, hands down, bar none. But you can also approach it just from an acting perspective. It's a masterclass. It is absolutely a masterclass in terms of what we're given is dialogue that we normally see on stage, and then acting that is so specifically for the camera. And what we're able to get is like this perfect meld of the complexity of the dialogue and these minute, tiny expressions of these masterful actors. It's astonishing.
Yeah, because the screen acting school and the stage acting school are very different, because on stage you have to be extremely expressive, and on screen you have to be subtle, smaller. So the camera picks up the small stuff. But the kind of dialogue you get in the show is definitely more of a theater stage, play dialogue, which you don't really see much of it on the TV or movie screen.
Yeah, the only thing, it's just Shakespearean film adaptations. You would see that kind of dialogue, but typically what you see with a lot of those adaptations as well is there is a fair amount of theatricality that still clings to the vestiges of these actors. But in Black Sails, it is completely stripped of that. And it's still these incredible performances, giving very, very cinematic performances with this very stagey dialogue. It's incredible. I love it. Okay, absolutely. Moving on. So in your fic, this holds the distinction of being the very first one that I have been sitting through with my script and reading through as a practice. Now, I'd already read it before, but just the first time reading it out loud, it made me cry.
Oh my God, for real?
For real. My husband walked in and he's like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "I'm sorry, this is just a lot right now."
I am so honored.
It is a one of the it's so fully thick with prose, and that in particular really moved me. Like, I love prose, and I don't get me wrong, I love dialogue, and I love performing dialogue, but the atmospheric kind of introspective dark night of the soul, which literally this is. It is a dark night of the soul. That kind of thing speaks to me so deeply. And so how did that affect you emotionally when you were writing it?
Oh, yeah, I think by the end of this, I was like very much obsessed at the time with analyzing the light and darkness and how it's used in the show, because that's one of the things that Flint does talk about in his famous final monologue. He talks about how it's defined that they will define everything by their light, that what they think is and what they say is the light and what they say is the darkness, because in the darkness there be dragons, but in the dark there can be freedom, there can be discovery and possibility. And I was thinking about a lot of the use of lighting, the use of shadow and light specifically with him, where he's present in the mise-en-scène, but also just in general in the entire show, how much it's very particular, how it's thought through. For instance, when the scene in season 2, episode 5 happens, the reveal, the kiss, it's like, yes, they're shrouded in the darkness, but it's like this one beam of light that sort of brings them out of it. There's freedom in the dark when someone has eliminated it. And also the parallel that I thought about, and some people also brought up, is when Max approaches Anne at the beginning of season 2, and she's telling her that, perhaps it would do well to bring it into the light. And that's when their first kiss happens. And it brings into the light a lot of things that were shrouded in the darkness within Anne. So it's like, yeah, those parallels are so immense and so masterful. I am just so normal about them. And then, of course, with Flint and Silver, with their whole, with their, there not being daylight between them. And then where there is daylight between them, that's when they're drawn apart. And that's also an interesting thing to observe as they, with the staging, with the mise-en-scène in the show on screen as the 4th season progresses. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said there. So I tried to use this terminology a lot within the Fig, as you may have noticed, that it was because he was in that space, the dark night of the soul, and the flickering beginning lights of the dawn, and what tomorrow would bring. I mean, I think it did touch me very deeply as well as I was writing it. It is, yeah.
There's a
now,
lot of...
I'm reading back through some of it. Anywhere he looked in Flint's past, there was always a void, a dark abyss left behind. And yeah. So basically, I was thinking, as he is there, it's kind of a little bit of a repeat, an echo of season 3 being in the belly of the beast. Not literally, but there was this huge throwback. And he does talk about it in the next episode after that, after the shark episode, as they call it, that they were in the belly of the beast. And right now he is also figuratively in a similar situation in that fort, in a very, very liminal stage where he is uncertain what is going to come. If Silver had just planted an idea in his mind and he's turning it over, what could tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, what could it bring? And so I think it was a time for him to mull it over and to have his ponderings about the nature of things, about the nature of his relationship with Thomas, how it had been, how it could become if they should meet again, what would it become? And of course, his relationship with Silver as well, and the nature of that, what it has become already.
Yeah. One of the things that you do really well is showing that hesitation in Flint, even allowing his thoughts to go in a certain direction, where he will start going and then, no, he couldn't, and then pull back. And we all have these mental checks and balances in our head where there's a fear of tipping over some precipice that we cannot, if we introduce a thought, we cannot pull back from that edge, that it is fully plummeting into this idea that if I allow this thought to take purchase, I will never shake it off. It will haunt me. Or even if it is something that we're hoping for or wishing for, I can't even picture it. I don't want to even go there because I don't want to be crushed by the disappointment of not having that. And there's so much of that in this story where you hear his hesitation in his own thoughts. And that is one of the things that really touched me as I was reading this. One of the things that Toby said in an interview when he was asked about the particular dynamic between Flint and Silver is he said, even if Flint did develop feelings of love beyond friendship for Silver, he would be absolutely terrified to even admit that to himself because of his history of loss, because of the guilt that he feels for those who he loves, who are lost along the path of, whatever endeavor he is engaged in. You look back at when Thomas is taken, it wasn't in James's path that Thomas was yanked away. Thomas was yanked away out of his own path because that was Thomas's impetus. It was his dream. It was his goal, which is, what instigated Alfred Hamilton going after them in the first place. But he still, even looking back, he still brings that on himself. He brings Miranda on himself. Of course, he takes on the ownership of Gates.
Yes. Well, that was his doing.
Yes, exactly.
Especially after Silver had pointed it out to him in their conversation at the end of season 3, that this line of succession that happens here, that, well, in a way, Silver has already insinuated himself as being the successor to all of these people. And he had pointed out the pattern, but I think this is also something that Flint had thought about before, that he had thought about how people who, he has felt that guilt already, and it sort of hit a nerve that was already hurting,
Yeah.
And yeah, this whole succession thing, I'm particularly interested in it because was pointed out to me by my friend Deck, who also was the same person who pointed out that the book he was reading was Pilgrim's Progress and not Meditations. But also Deck has talked about the ritual substitution. According to the Violence and the Sacred book by René Girard, and I have read it. So basically, a lot of what is going on with them two is the ritual substitution, because it's set up throughout season 3, and especially when Silver starts going on about how, well, I might actually be the end of you. I already possess both the being liked and being feared, which makes me more powerful than you are. And he also at the same time talks about how he dreads it, how he does not want that to happen, and how he has trepidations because of it. And then in the beginning scene of season 4, we have them sitting in the cabin, and Flint quotes a Bible passage that isn't really about that, but you can kind of hear the echoes of it there as well, where, the old shall serve the young and be basically replaced and substituted by it. And the entirety of season 4 is that passing on of the crown, especially it culminates in episode 8, where they sit and Flint says it outright that he doesn't want the crown anymore, that it's you and Maddie, it's you and her that are fit to rule the world in balance right now. God, that one has me in such grip when he says you are the best of us. I was just my heart. I don't care how many times I have watched that scene, and I've seen it a fair few. It affects me the same every single time. It's both the overall story, it's the writing, and the way that it's delivered is just overwhelmingly heartbreaking, because you understand that it's an equal part of him just being so tired, and also genuinely seeing himself as this beast that has to be taken out of the equation for peace to come forward, because he does not have peace in him anymore. That has been That
that has
me
been
so much.
Stolen from him. He cannot be that person anymore, and he has to take himself out of the story. And it is so sad, because at that point, like, you were so fully involved. And I know that people approach the story, attaching to different characters. I am ride or die Flint. And from the beginning, he was such an interesting character. One of the things that I love about the conversation that he has with Silver in episode 310 is why does
my favorite?
Why does Silver ask him in that way? Why does he say, in whose name is this war being fought? There's
interesting one.
There's so much knowledge behind that question.
Yes.
Of, listen, I see you and I think I understand you. Please tell me if I'm right. And I think he understood at that point. I think he understood, and he needed context for this idea that he had in his mind about Flint's motivations and just what type of person he was. And that's why I think he goes right out of that new knowledge that he's been given, right into, listen, I know that I am the closest person in the world to you. And I know that I am in this succession of people that have been lost along your path.
And he said, I know that I am next in the succession of people extremely dear to you. Next in the succession of people that you love, basically, is what he's saying. And people who love you. He is also saying that.
Yes.
And he didn't even probably realize what it was that he said.
Yeah. He knew before he asked the question. He knew that there was something beneath everything. And that for me makes that scene so much more resonant, because you see Silver's understanding and you see his quiet acceptance of this, and he isn't shocked.
Yeah.
There is no, there's no recoil or, this was not new information. And
it basically corroborated the theory he had already had in his brain.
Yeah. It was like, okay, this checks out. And so it's just, they were already from, I think you can start from, when they take the warship, they're already starting to click so mentally in tune with each other that it was just a natural, just being in his vicinity for that long. Of course, he's going to pick up on it.
And it's amazing how little Silver lets on about himself to other people, but he is extremely perceptive about others himself. Yeah. He's like very tuned into them.
He's just a sponge. He's just soaking up.
Yep, soaking everything up.
All of these little details, like when Max drops the information about the plantation. Just all of these little details.
He immediately thinks about the next thing.
Yeah.
What if Thomas? What if he was alive? What if I could bring him back? What it just takes maybe 2 hours to mull it over in his brain. And maybe in those 2 hours, I have a theory that was the time he actually even sent a man out to Georgia, check out if Thomas is really there. And in that time, he comes to Flint and he's like, listen, what if? Here's a hypothetical. Because that was the first thing he thought of when he just heard of a possibility of somebody sending, the wealthy families sending a relative that is inconvenient for them. His brain made that connection so quickly because he was thinking about Flint. He does think about him a lot and he cares about him a lot. And I think that was part of what, and because he was driven by, okay, I don't want to lose anyone to this war. And we already know that at that point, they have had the conversation about whether or not this could be enough. And he didn't get a response from Flint then. And he didn't get a response from Marty either, whether he would be enough. And I think he understood both of those as a no. And he is like, okay, they are too entrenched in this, and I have to find a way to get them out of this entrenchment or I will lose them. And he's already also somebody who has lost people before. We know there's this feel about him that he cannot bear to lose somebody who is dear to him, and that is his motivation doing everything he's done.
Yeah, one of the things I talked to, because of everybody's schedules, I've had to record some stuff out of sequence of when it's going to actually air on the podcast. So we're going to be featuring Cinnamon.
Oh yes, the one that
yeah. And so I talked to Tora,
yes, that's the author.
Last week, and one of the things that we talked about that she brought up that was so spot on is that Flint and Silver represent fight versus flight, and that Flint is always fighting,
hands on, just going with a knife.
Yeah. Silver is always running. So, and even with that clash at the end, it is still a clash of fight versus flight, except Flint is fighting for Silver, and Silver is running from the very possibility of losing Maudie or Flint.
Yep.
It's just, yeah. And so there is that connection. And so I can't understand the perspective of people who view Silver simply as kind of the villain of the tale. I don't think
is setting him up as a future, as he is appearing as a villain in Treasure Island. But we should understand that this is one of the points the show makes, that yes, you will be distorted by the narrative. You will be turned into a monster by it. That is going to happen. And a tale is true, a tale isn't true. As Jack says, it doesn't even matter at the end. It's the stories that will survive. And we already know, because within that speech, we already see the book that the governor wrote being read by Mrs. Hudson to her children, and the big, candlelight right in the front. Their light, their reasons, their judgment, and they're telling their children stories about monsters already in real time.
And it's interesting because, if you look at it from a meta standpoint, how much of Treasure Island is the stories they tell their children. How much of Treasure Island, if you look at the two side by side, and Black Sails being the source material for Treasure Island instead of the other way around, because that's the only way that you can really look at it, knowing the themes of Black Sails, that Treasure Island is a product of Black Sails and not the other way around. That's the only way that it works. It's the only way it holds up. So taking Treasure Island, kind of this canonic view, is a little bit restrictive, I think, because, there's all kinds of things that can be twisted about the story. And it's so interesting. It's so interesting. What I would love is for the Black Sails creators to do Treasure Island, but through that filter of the real story is based on the events of Black Sails, and maybe this is the true Treasure Island. I think that would be really, really interesting.
It's the prequel that is completely recontextualizing everything.
Yes.
And that's the beauty of it.
Yeah. So there's a really powerful connection that Flint has with the idea of belonging to a place, to belonging to a home. And much of what transpires can equally be derived from his loss of that home. And, he says, and society kind of ripping him away from it. He says to Vane, when he's trying to coerce him over to that side. I
love that conversation so much.
The whole Blackbeard. When he's trying to convince him to come over and betray Teach. And he says, they took my home.
My home. And the question he asks at the end is, who are you? And where is your home, essentially?
Yeah, exactly. Because home is as much a place as it is people. So, your home moves with you, with the people that you love and the people that you surround yourself with. You take your home with you, essentially. So when Flint is saying they took my home, they not only took England, they not only took Nassau, they took Miranda. And she was
He was
home.
the only person who remained to him as a home. That place, the house itself, and her being alive, that was what was left of home, of the thing that he had. And that is why I think at the end, if what we hear from Silver's tale, what we see on screen from this tale, if we believe it to be true, that even it was a plantation, even if we see him going right back under the yoke, putting down the swords and taking up shovels again, but he was there with Thomas, and that's why it's home, because he is with the one who is his home now.
So how much of that parallel, how deeply does that resonate for you? Because you are, in essence, the same, where you have been displaced from your home, and literally society, a group of people, a culture has been trying to systematically rob you and those you love of that home. How has that affected your connection to the show?
Oh yeah, greatly. I mean, even especially right now, in the light of the latest, like I am watching my home being right before my eyes, and I've been to many, many places. I've visited multiple countries. I've visited European capitals and non-capitals, and what I can say is, as they say, East or West, home is best. And it's not just because I love my city, and I do, but also because my family rests there, and I am feeling very much, roots torn out of the ground, and I feel that sort of loss of connection. But at the same time, I think on my path, I was never truly alone because, partly because of the friends that I met through this fandom, who have supported me every step of the way, who have provided me the support that is, emotional, to whom I can always go and whom I can always talk to. So yeah, I can find and build a new home here. Of course, I will eventually very much want to go back, because I think, unlike with Flint, it still remains home to me. It's just, yeah, we are faced with a civilization that seeks to eradicate us, as you said, and I really resonate with him. I resonate with Mari saying that she would never accept any pardon, that the war that she's fighting will not be bargained away for a fight that is greater, that it's bigger than everyone. And of course, their conversation in season 4, episode 3, when Flynn says an empire survives because we believe the survival to be inevitable, but it isn't inevitable. And I would carve that onto my eyelids. I don't know. If I could own a single scene from a TV show, like that would be it. And when she turns around and quotes Don Quixote at him, it was just such an amazing moment.
Oh yeah, definitely. And Flint's reaction to that,
he's in awe
completely. The realization of who she is, that this is someone who is a kindred spirit. This is someone who
absolutely
is just
the connection
like me.
That is built between them in that time. When Silver is away, they bond both over the loss of him, right? Because both of them miss him, and they are much, willing to both, they wish to find him. They hope that he is alive, but they're also at the same time preparing to grieve. And then in that meantime, they also find a connection between them beyond that shared person who they love, and that they are indeed kindred spirits. And I love their dynamic. Like, this is my favorite platonic dynamic probably in the whole show.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I love them so much.
One of the things that I think was kind of keeping them at odds before Silver is presumed dead is that they were both approaching the relationship as being so protective of Silver. And definitely. So they each viewed the other as a threat. And so they had that kind of buffer where they weren't actually communicating with each other. They were communicating about Silver. And so when you remove him out of the equation, they're finally able to, actually come together and address each other without that buffer in the middle. And it's just...
And yeah, rediscover how similar actually they are.
Exactly.
How close they are in terms of spirit. I love that.
And so what is your favorite line or passage that you've written, whether it's from this story or something else that you've written?
Yeah, well, I was kind of going back, reading it back, and I think it's really tough, but I think the part where, as you've talked about this, where he catches himself on a thought and he kind of doubts it. So, and once again, he catches himself on a thought and a choice of word, those he loves. Is that so? What was that the reason why he had nearly plunged himself into the water, leaving behind his men, and the realization that there wasn't a way to explain it to them if he had left them to continue the fight without him? Only that reminder had stopped him then.
That is my favorite as well.
Oh.
That literally, when you started reading that, I'm like, oh, yes, because yes, that was the point that I started to tear up. I was like, because when you hear that, you can immediately picture that scene where literally he starts to take off his coat. He is about to go over the edge.
Yeah.
And then he pulls himself back like, I can't do this. I can't.
Yeah, because how am I going to explain? What am I going to say to them? I'm abandoning my whole crew, what's left of it, to go dive after one person. Maddie, everybody was kind of more of a public relationship, Maddie and Silver, and people had to hold her back physically, like several people at the same time, so that she doesn't plunge in. But Flint, like, he has a responsibility. He has the crown still, and he has to carry it. And he has to lead them into battle, and he cannot abandon that responsibility right now, even though he so wanted to.
And it's such a telling moment because throughout the course of the show, many people have been lost in battle, lost over the side, that you have never, ever seen him react that way before.
Yep.
He will not...
He was treating his crew as disposable, basically, at the beginning. And everyone is interchangeable. And he goes from that to, we leave no man behind by the end. Like, I love his progression here.
Silver becomes so precious to him.
Absolutely.
There's no other way to, because at a certain point, if you're looking at Flint viewing Silver merely as a tool, a means to an end, his usefulness stops when he loses his leg.
I mean, I was thinking about that so much in season 3, episode 3, the shark episode, is when, everybody is starving, parched, and he designates these rations to, okay, so we're going from the strongest men to the weakest, basically, and the ones who are really, really instrumental to hailing this ship to, wherever it needs, whenever we see anywhere close to the ground. And then he gives Silver the full same amount as himself. And Silver thought, I think he was against it because he thought for a second, because of his, like, we've seen it in the first episode, the second with Muldoon, right? Talking to him about how he feels useless. He feels like he's no longer useful on this ship. Yeah. And it's like, no, my brother in Christ, you would never be discarded by Flint at this point. You're so much and so far deep in this entrenchment. He would never do that. He is going to give you the last piece of his bread and never, he thought that he was going to be on the shit list, basically, but that would never happen at that point because it was just too far. They were just too involved, and he was just too precious to him.
Yeah, you look at the progression. So when Silver comes to in the captain's quarters on the
warship, God, I love that scene so much.
That the expression on Flint's face is so gentle.
He's so
fond. You don't see him have that expression outside of any interaction in the entire show unless it is Miranda or Thomas. There's nothing even approaching that with Gates. It is Silver, Miranda, Thomas. Those are those secret moments. Those are those quiet smiles, those gentle, the crinkling of the eyes, just where he glows. He glows onto Silver. He already has such a deep affection for him. And when Silver tells him about the treasure and makes up this story, I fully believe that Flint knows he's lying about it.
Yes, he knew everything right away.
He could have, he very well could have immediately killed him. He can't do that. But he also cuts himself off completely because he's like, I am emotionally compromised by this man already, and I can't allow myself to go there. So when he finally tells him on the little dinghy, and when he finally tells him the truth, that it's not that he is relieved that Silver stole from me. I knew that. I just wanted I wanted honesty between us.
It's because Silver was honest with him finally. It's because he was 100% with him. And that's why Flint was so taken aback by it. Like, okay, we have no secrets between us now. And I think that situation was what brought on his decision to finally open up about his past and tell him about the demons, and where they come from. Yeah. Is because at that point he thought, okay, there are no secrets between us now.
Yeah. And because Silver telling him that was such an act of trust in terms of, you can kill me right now. I am putting myself entirely at your mercy and making myself incredibly vulnerable to you, because I believe that this relationship is something that deserves to be repaired, and that we cannot go forward when there is any kind of an obstruction between us. And so very much the reestablishment of that trust is what just springboards them forward. So you talked about your main focus of writing being almost nonfiction or essay type exploration. So what is your process for that like?
Honestly, the process for this one was just stream of consciousness. I just wrote the way I would write a Twitter thread about some meta take of mine about, like, because I've been thinking about it and it was like living rent free in my head so much, and I just have to put it to paper. It was mostly stream of consciousness, and then I would edit and I would add things and subtract things, and I would translate it. And when I worked, obviously I've gone to seek Anne Bonny's help, Gustav Anne Bonny, thank you very much, my English teacher friend, who just amazingly beta read everything. And I just asked them, like, oh, okay, what verb should I use here? Do you know any good synonyms to this word? Or like, does this sound natural, etc., etc.? So yeah, I created the first version in Ukrainian and then went from there. And I think I also did that because I saw that there weren't enough Ukrainian fics on AO3, and I really wanted to fix that. And especially that there weren't any in the Black Sails fandom. And when I started getting comments on my fic, that people who were also fellow Ukrainians and fans of Black Sails who hadn't seen anything like that, they were just so thrilled to see this, because like, oh my God, like, I've tapped into this audience that I knew existed. It had to exist because I am here. So somebody like me out there is bound to exist. And I know I already have a mutual on Twitter who's also a Ukrainian Black Sails fan. And like, yeah, he's so
awesome,
sweet, by the way.
Oh, good. So what is your background in English? Because in talking to you, it's astonishing because I've spoken with Tora as well, who is Polish. And so both of you.
I could talk to her in Polish then.
Oh, you speak Polish. That's incredible.
I had it in school. Strangely, even though we're not in the West, but we had like Polish in my school, which really helped me when I moved, like I crossed the border and first stop was Poland. So like I could get around a little bit, just on the level of going to the supermarket, buying something, like ordering coffee. I can do that. So that really helped. I'm glad that weirdly, I had like such a foreign language focused school. We barely even learned anything else. We had very weak chemistry. Physics was only interesting because our physicist teacher was interesting. Like, he was a walking meme and everybody loved him. Mathematics wasn't really taught very well. I am stereotypical. I'm gay. I don't do math. But yeah, English. We had 7 hours at some point. I remember 7 hours of English a week. That's like at least one every day. On 2 days, we had 2 classes of English. Yeah, so that's why. That's my background.
Yeah, because your fluency level is astonishing. It really is. And
everybody tells me that. I quote, "Your English is so good," end quote. I hear that about 5 times a week.
It really is.
I might be exaggerating a little bit, but every British person that I know have said that to me.
It very much is. Not only do I hear you familiar with idiomatic speech patterns and things like that, it's just astonishing. And it was the same thing with talking to Tora, where with native English speakers, there's a whole lot more editing that I have to do with interviews to pull out filler words like and I include myself in that.
That's because I've been browbeat into not having filler words in my speech, and I try to not have them.
So
we've always been told, don't do that. Don't say these words. Work around them. Say other things. Don't just go like. Well, I still do that a little bit, but I understand it's not that bad, generally speaking. That it's kind of like a restrictive norm, but I also, I try not to do it. There are a lot of times where my brain would be, blanking a little bit, and I will just sit there, just sit there.
Yeah, and that is a lot easier to edit around than trying to pull like out of the middle of a sentence. So it's awesome because what I'm even just talking to you now, I'm like, this is going to be so easy to edit. And it's the same thing with Tora. Like I am almost done editing that discussion, and I breezed through it. I was just like, amazing. So yes, just as a native English speaker, your English is astonishingly good. Really is. So I know you worked with Ghost of Ambani in terms of both beta and the English translation. So what was that process like?
Yeah, I basically would hit them up and be like, hey, how do I say this passage? So basically I would just send a screenshot of my passage, and she would be like, okay, so yeah, this is good, and this is where you'd probably be better off saying this instead, and like wording it like that and putting these words in that order. And I was also asking for like, oh yeah, do you know synonyms for this? Do you know synonyms for it? Because also another thing that I have internalized throughout my like academic path is, especially with writing, is that I've been taught to not repeat myself, like to not use the same word many, many times in the sentence. So I was really asking for these, do you know synonyms for this? Do you know how I could say this otherwise so that I don't repeat too much? It basically was just like that. It was me sending snippets. Well, at some point, the whole Google Doc, just read it over. It was very similar to working on the zine piece and doing that with the mod who was working, with writing.
I have hours and hours and hours of conversation with Ghost of Ambani. We started talking when I was still living in Japan. Because they had actually lived in Japan for 10 years. So I had about half that time. I was there for 5 years. But when I was asking about this particular fic, and they were like, listen, I took a look at some passages, but that was all him, like all of that structure, all of that prose. And So the flow of that prose and everything, just so astonishing. Honestly.
This is my first.
It's just beautiful. And just the way, hold on. This is my fic folder.
Oh my God.
Hold on. But even just the end, where the starless sky bled into the obscure depths of the sea, where on the ancient maps in the corners there lurked dragons, the beam of sunlight would rise.
I'm proud of that one. One.
It's gorgeous. It's gorgeous. Very nice. What are your favorite tropes?
This is interesting. There was a thing going on Twitter lately where people were sharing their trope tier lists.
I saw that, yeah.
And I don't go by tropes usually. Well, okay, if something is, let's say, I like a slow burn, definitely. I've read fics that have like 30 chapters, more than 30 chapters. I like some hurt comfort. Well, it's good old, I like something that is set in the canon universe, but kind of subverts it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a fix it in a way, or like a different ending. And I like post-canon. Actually, I've had an idea for a post-canon. I don't know about whether or not I will write it. It's not a fact, but I just love me some post-canon Black Sails, I've read several of them, including Merchant Ships Have, what was the name? Merchant Ships Have, I don't remember the full name of the fic, but it's like, one of those where they meet again after years and years, and they hash out the things that needs to be hashed out, and it just so beautifully explores that. And I like myself some exploration, and I also like a modern AU if it's set in a historical period, or if it's one historical period to be set in another, for instance.
Yeah.
And see how that plays out. My go-tos.
So do you have a background in creative writing?
Not so much, actually. A creative, I wouldn't say, like, I've done essays and I've done like published more nonfiction stuff, but I wouldn't say I do have a creative writing background. I'm not like a linguist, I've studied mostly philosophy, culture, history. We did one semester of script writing, and I didn't even finish my assignment to write a script because I had no ideas. I didn't have an idea of what to write my script about. And look at me now, I am a published creative writer in a way.
So are you working on anything right now?
I wouldn't call it working on it, but I have something for now that is like an idea, a setting in my head. It's more like a sketch, like a sketch of a scene. And I would probably need to build out from that scene. So it is a post-canon. It starts, it just came to me one night, I suppose. It starts when Silver in a pub is giving his talk, is telling people stories about how he knew Flint, and Flint his own self was feared he wasn't proud, and a certain someone overhears it and challenges him on it and is like, oh, are you saying he was proud of you? And it turns out that somebody was Thomas Hamilton, and that is how they run into each other. And yeah, that's it basically. And I have to kind of bring it to a point where they actually get to talk to each other and, figure, yes, they're talking about the same man, but also one of them only knows him as the man that he knew from Nassau as Flint, and the other only knew at first James, and then hadn't known anything about him since their separation. So, like, I don't know how to get them there and how to bring Silver back to meet Flint again. And for all the three of them to hash it out, I don't really know how to execute that. But that is the idea. That is the setup.
Oh, that would be so good. Yeah, I do.
No, I just can't write plots, unfortunately.
I do hope that you're able to see that to fruition, because I would absolutely love to read it.
Oh, one day perhaps.
Are you reading anything right now?
Fic wise, well, I have gotten into a new fandom and quite still strongly in it, the game Disco Elysium. And I am currently reading something about that. But it's also, it gets a little bit close to home as well, because a couple of the fics, well, I don't know, like this is a little spoilery about the setting of the game, but basically, uh, they have like the coalition forces, which is like the coalition of other governments, and they have like warships in the air above the city of Revachol, and like the threat of bombings and nuclear warfare. And I think some of it is a bit too much for me to read right now. So, and as of literature, I have recently acquired a collection of Walt Whitman. So I am immersing myself in poetry. I really, really love. I've heard a couple of poems from Leaves of Grass years ago. It was somebody who did a reading of them and put it on YouTube. And I was just like immediately entranced. So I'm glad that I got my hands on a complete collection of his work now. And I could just sit and read. There's so many good ones in A Song of Myself that, it's good stuff.
Very, very nice. So what are your top 5 favorite fics?
I haven't been able to narrow it down to 5. I'm sorry.
Okay, whatever you want to expand it to.
So, okay, I'm going to get out of the way the ones that everybody says. Orange Verse, of course. That's, comfort fic, honestly, for me.
It really is.
Butterscotch, that whole series, of course. Amazing. Love it so much. Then, okay, so there's this series that focuses on this one, a headcanon that is quite common in the fandom, that Silver is Jewish, and I share that headcanon too. And there's a whole series called Tether by Steel 3, I believe the author is, and it's like these several fics that take part, and they focus on Silver, Jewish Silver, and he meets like other people. This Jewish girl who's an OC named Rebecca, and she's so precious. I love a well-written OC. Honestly, just like, and everybody meets by the end of it. Well, kind of everybody. I suppose it's not one where Miranda is alive. Of course, I love me a fic where Miranda is alive, but this one is the one where Thomas and James are, and they eventually also. Oh, okay. Another one that is very, very interesting. It puts a spin on a canon universe. I think it's called I Dance with Your Ghost. It's from. Okay, so when Max talks about sending the Oglethorpe plantation, where people are sending off their inconvenienced them, and she's like, I would have sent you there, right? To Silver. So this is an AU where she actually sends Silver away, and he is there, and he meets Thomas Hamilton, and he doesn't know who it is. And and eventually they do find out, because they keep talking about the man that they don't know is the same man, and they eventually realize, oh my god, you are Thomas Hamilton. And that one is really good.
I read that one as well. I love that. And I think Jay, in terms of the Tether series, Jay referenced the Tether series as well.
Oh my god, taste.
Yes.
Also, this is from my good friend Mary, but the one also based on a headcanon that I share personally with Trans Silver, and it's called Many Ways to Be John Silver, and it's about Silver and Maddie, and I love them so much. They're so precious, and I'm just so honored, and she wrote that with me in mind, so I'm like completely just so touched by that. And there's so another one by a friend as well. You probably already have had it mentioned, and you will have it, I believe, as a series, right? The biopic of Charles Vane, as I call it.
Yes.
What's in the name?
Yes.
Yeah, we've discussed it so much, and just like I ran by Anne so many of the things, and she ran it by me as well, when writing that fic, just kind of exchanging with each other, okay, what do you think about this? So I don't know if it's really honest to be nice, like if it's not cheating, but because I also kind of a little bit had a hand in it, but I really I enjoyed that, and I love that it's just going to be this big thing focused on origins of Charles. Another thing that I really loved was so this is from Thomas Hamilton's perspective, and it's him being from the time that he's sent away from Bedlam on a ship to Georgia, his entire time on the plantation, and then to the day that Flint comes back and he meets them, they meet each other again. It's called the Unaccommodated Man, and it's basically just his perspective of being in that plantation for all of these 10 years, and it's just so masterfully written. I love it.
Oh, wow. I will have to look that one up, because there really isn't enough focus on Thomas in terms of the fanfic universe. And but there's so much, because we are lacking so much of his story. There is so much of a void to fill, that it really is kind of rich meat for exploration.
And he's an interesting one too, because he starts off he's a visionary, but he's also very sheltered, and he doesn't have the full perspective on the things that he wants to bring, like the change he wants to bring about. But I think in his time there, outside, being in captivity, most likely he changes his perspective. I had canon that he'd become an abolitionist while he was there. So, yeah.
Yeah, because when you look at Thomas's plans for Nassau going back to 1705, when he's actually formulating these plans and discussing them with James, again, all of it is being approached from a civilization perspective, going in as colonizers.
From an Englishman.
And exactly. And so looking at long-term the characters of Thomas and James, so much of James gravitating towards Thomas is just the aura of the man and the integrity of him. But you understand that James was fully not in support of Thomas's vision for Nassau.
Naive that plan was, basically.
Exactly. He understood that this was not something that could work long term, because he had been there and he had seen the corruption. He had seen, the boy's throat being slit in the streets. He understood the naivete of those plans, but he was swayed because of his love for Thomas. He was going to support Thomas, and he was going to support those plans because he loved him so deeply. Long term, had they gone forward, the inevitable clash that would have happened between these two very polar opposite ideologies would have driven them apart. But because of everything that happened in the interim, because of all of this time that Thomas spent understanding the full weight of what civilization did to him, what it did to cause the loss of James and Miranda, it would have brought him a certain way towards James's perspective, and everything that James has been through would have brought him a little bit closer in terms of Thomas. And I think them growing in these directions individually would have created a bit more of an even ground. Because, of course, Thomas is also coming at it from, he is miles higher than James in rank in terms of him being a lord.
That is, yeah.
And so bringing them down to, to an even footing also is just very interesting to see where they would go forward, and Thomas's journey of getting there. So I'd be really interested to read more fics that are from Thomas's perspective, and especially during that interim of what was happening during that whole story.
And I think, I've touched upon it in the fic, in what Flint is talking about as he is there in the fort, and he is thinking about what would it be when they would meet again, because he has changed so much and he has walked away from their original plan. And I've rewatched season 3, episode 4 recently, where he is talking about this out loud, saying to Silver that I don't know if I'm what I'm doing is right anymore because I've swayed so far away from what we were fighting for in the beginning. And it feels like he's betraying that plan. But this is, in the next season, so much has changed that he now understands that plan wasn't all it. It wasn't, viable at the end of the day. And what he's doing now is the right thing. And I think he is thinking about what it would be when they meet again, but also not just him who's changed, right? Thomas has changed a lot as well. And so that, it, as you say, may have actually brought them closer together in their perspectives.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, and looking at that, and I know that we had, I think way back, kind of discussed this on Twitter a little bit, where I think Silver is the perfect blend right in the middle in terms of ideology between James and Thomas, and is the only one in the story that fully comes to understand both sides of James. He sees James and he sees Flint, and he's the only one that does that, and he accepts him. Now, it's unfortunate that he inevitably betrays him at the end. You can argue that is coming from a place of love, and I do believe that. But he does see all of him. And in the conversation with Maddie, where he is telling the story of what happened to Flint, you see that realization where he says, I wasn't seeing Flint anymore.
Yeah, he saw the James underneath the mask. I think my theory is that the James that was initially was no longer there, and he would never come back. That Flint has some part of him changed forever. That the last vestiges of that James died when Miranda died, when she was shot in front of him. And so what he sees at the end, what John sees at the end, is not Flint, not James McGraw, the lieutenant, but somebody entirely different. Somebody who's stripped of all the other, personas, who's stripped of his roles, who is just a man now, just James.
Yeah. And there is that shine in Silver's eyes when he is saying that. There's this accumulation of tears that
God.
And it is now, there are two ways to interpret that. And you can either twist the knife and say, this is the shine of a very good storyteller who is reveling in their performance. But I don't believe that to be true.
I believe he truly believes that.
I believe he is literally seeing a memory that he is having, that he is reliving this moment that was so emotional for him, that he is now, as he's telling Maddie, realizing in that moment, the welling up of tears, he's realizing in that moment how much he just sacrificed, how much he just gave away.
When Flint says, you gave it away here in this moment, on this island, and left the ground with that chest. And then 30 years later, he's coming back to the island to find what he left in the ground there. It's not the chest, it's not the money. It's never been about the money. It's what he and Flint have built, is what they've had, and he can't get it back. And he knows that. And and that's why, he finds an empty hole in the ground. And it's not just the chest that is absent. He realizes he had given that away 30 years ago, and he's never getting it back.
Yeah. There's so much rich metaphor, and so the depth of feeling in this story, it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming to approach, which is why it is infinitely rewatchable. There's so much of a pressure of the story crushing down on you when the show is over. It is a wonderful ending. It is a beautifully written ending, but the weight of that ending is what sends people immediately back to episode 1, because it's wait, okay, can we get out from under this? Can we get out from under this? Just even just episode 1, just the brightness of Nassau, I need it right now. And I don't know how many people I've talked to who said as soon as it ended, they started it again. And
I think I was just too out of it. I think it took me a whole day, 8 hours it took me to watch the last episode, because I was just like doing it in bouts. And I was crying the whole time, just all throughout it.
Yeah.
It's
sobbing.
Really, it's done a number on me. And every time actually I revisit it, it just does me in.
So what advice would you have for people who are wanting to break into the Black Sails universe in terms of fic writing?
I don't know if I'm really the person to go for advice, because again, this is my first sort of debut fic. But because I was somebody who thought I wouldn't do this, and then I did it, and it's amazingly landed well with people, and people have liked it. So this was a success. I am saying, well, okay, the way I wrote this, I just went with the flow. I couldn't sleep one night, and this is entirely autobiographical, because I was thinking about, well, how Flint is also probably a light sleeper or an insomniac. So I was kind of projecting onto him. So yeah, the first line was Flint couldn't sleep, because I couldn't sleep. And then I just went on, with the flow of this sort of stream of consciousness. And it is entirely self-indulgent. But I think my advice would be don't be afraid. Don't fear and shy away from self-indulgent writing, if that's what's holding you back. It might be sometimes the thing that you really bring out that will touch people, that will land with them.
Yeah. And it is such a beautiful kind of a moment in time. It captures just this ambient resonance within Flint, which I think is beautifully illustrated, because now I'm going to bring up Kelsey's cover art that I am just so floored. It's gassed. It's stunning. Absolutely stunning. I asked her, and one of the things that, I'm just going to, so when I am working on an episode, I get to a point and I bring in Kelsey and just give them the bare bones idea of a piece, and just, this is the general idea, this is the mood, here's a link to the fic. And I said, can you have it done? And it ended up being like a week and a half. They did it in 3 days, and it was amazing. By the time you listen to this, you will have seen it, and I will have posted it everywhere a billion times. It's absolutely
as you should.
Yeah, it's so beautiful, Kelsey. Amazing as always, but this one is just so beautiful and beautifully captures the spirit of this story. It's just gorgeous. Well, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me about this and allowing me to feature your story. I know that, this is an emotional time for you, a difficult time for you, reflecting on family, but I just want to thank you for taking the time. I know that the fandom is going to be very excited to listen and to be able to get your perspective out, especially at a time where Ukrainian voices are being crushed. And I think it's very important that, just in my little corner of the internet and my little podcast that, I'm able to let you be heard. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much for having me on the podcast. It has been an honor and has been amazing to talk to you, and yes, to share my own thoughts about all of this. That I'm always willing to talk about this show to anyone who's willing to listen. And you also had a lot of amazing and insightful things to say, and I'm just like, I really, really love this conversation that we've had.
Thank you so much.
I hope that people love my fic.
I'm sure they do. And I hope that I'm able to do it justice. I'm just so excited for this episode. And thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leckie. It has been an honor and a privilege to have you on the podcast. And for your guidance on the Ukrainian and Polish pronunciation, my apologies for any shortcomings in that regard. You can trust that my heart was in the right place. Thank you to Kelsey, aka Magic Bubble Pipe, who drew the gorgeous sketch of Flint imprisoned in the fort under that glorious shaft of light featured online for today's story. You can find them on Tumblr at Magic Bubble Pipe and on Patreon. Kelsey does stunning work and takes commissions, so definitely check them out. And thank you to all of our listeners. Whether you're returning or joining us for the first time, we appreciate you and we'd love to hear from you. Please remember to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and a review. It truly does help us to be discovered by more listeners, which helps to shine a brighter spotlight on these amazing artists and creators. If you're a fanfic author and have a favorite story you'd love to hear and want to join me on the podcast, please reach out to me on Twitter at KendraSpring or at AudioficPod, or you can send an email to readingbetweenthelinesPod@gmail.com. If you're not an author, but you've got a favorite fic you'd like me to read, all suggestions are welcome. Please reach out. Thanks again for listening. This has been Reading Between the Lines, a fanfic audio podcast. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.